Termo to Madeline, audio edition, page 11. MacDonald and Geller, two rough bachelors. Men who first came to the Madeline Plains, as with all the desert areas east of the Sierras, were tough, unbending, and uncompromising. But then, the environment to which they came was just the same, if not worse. Raids by Pit River Indians were really only a minor problem compared with the many other hazards they faced. Deep mud, caused by spring flooding, dryness, and dust and lack of drinking water in the summer, deep snows and severe temperatures in the winter, all added to the problem of it being, at the very least, a full day's ride on horseback to civilization. That civilization was probably no more than another settler. Civilization at the most meant a small frontier town such as Susanville, Alturas, or Cedarville. In order to survive, men had to be as rough as the surrounding in which they came. Two such men were Solomon Geller and Daniel MacDonald. Sol Geller came with his sheep to Madeline Creek in the summer of 1869. Daniel MacDonald, the very first white settler on the west side of the Madeline Plains, came to the base of Mount MacDonald in the spring of 1868. MacDonald, like Geller, was a single man, as near as can be ascertained. However, he owned a few cattle and horses. His nearest neighbor, the first summer, and for the next several years, was a fellow named Jim Looper. He camped on Marsh Creek. Sol Geller came in the next year, but his camp was about 14 miles away. There were neighbors across the mountain at Red Rock and Cold Springs. 2 years later, a man by the name of Frank Thomas moved into Tule Marsh, and MacDonald must have felt right downtown. Thomas was only about 7 or 8 miles away. MacDonald built himself a rude cabin on the creek that would later be called Van Loan Creek, and filled on 160 acres of what at the time was some beautiful meadow land. His cabin was just below a couple of springs near the bottom of the canyon. A couple of small fenced-off pastures provided for easy wrangling of his saddle horses, and the rest of his stock ranged wherever they chose. Daniel MacDonald was by no means a large operator, but he was the first on the scene and thus acquired one of the choicest sites on the plains. He put up as much hay off the meadows as he could and get his cattle through the winter. During the summer, he led the life of a nomad, riding herd on his animals, but always making his headquarters on Van Loan Creek. Always he lived the life of a hermit, far from other people and happy with his existence. MacDonald continued to add to his land holdings, and by the time he left the Madeline Plains 13 years later, he owned 327 acres. In the spring of 1881, he sold everything he had except 2 horses and a pack outfit, with his bedroll and a few groceries, to Elmer Van Loan. He asked for and got a top price of $3,000 for his property. The price of gold coin tied in a sack and neatly packed away at the bottom of an alforjas, Daniel MacDonald set out on horseback for the South Fork, leading his pack horse. He never made it there, though. Somewhere beyond Tule Lake, according to legend, Indians ambushed and killed him, taking both his horses and the money. It seems that many of the first Madeline Plains settlers suffered unhappy endings. Solomon Geller was no exception, although his life ended without violence. Sol Geller was mostly a sheep man, although he did run some Durham cattle. He ranged his animals all the way from Honey Lake to Ash Valley and to South Fork. He found excellent summer range on the Madeline Plains above Madeline Creek, and on Fredonia Mountain above Horse Lake. While ranging his sheep in the area, he maintained his headquarters on Madeline Creek, where it flows into the Flat. He filed on 160 acres that took in a mile of the creek and 320 acres of swampland a half a mile out in the flat. He also filed the first water rights on Madeline Creek, claiming all the water flowing in it. He built a cabin and a bunch of sheep corrals there and had similar camps in Ash Valley, South Fork Valley, and Honey Lake Valley. Geller did have one fairly close neighbor on the Madeline Plains for a while. A fellow by the name of James Watt came to Mud Springs also in 1869. He lived that summer in a tent, and when or how he left seems to have faded into a mist over the years. Geller sold his Madeline Plains holdings to Thomas G. Davidson, another sheepman, in the summer of 1873. But he continued to range his sheep on the plains' vast unclaimed lands for the next several years. He just moved his headquarters a little farther north toward Marsh Creek. Running sheep on the plains in those years was very difficult. Lambing and shearing had to be accomplished at just the right time to prevent the cold weather from taking its toll. And it was no place to winter a band of sheep. Getting caught in a snowstorm on the way down to lower elevations could put a man out of the sheep business real fast. Geller and Davidson both lost large percentages of their bands over the years. Losses were common in all business on the Madeline Plains then, as they are now. Saul Geller lost more than the average, though. He lost his mind. He was committed to the insane asylum at Napa, California, in the summer of 1880. Which proves one point. If a person isn't crazy for going to Madeline Plains in the first place, he stands a good chance of leaving that way if he spends any length of time there. Theodore Winters, in the establishment of the Marsh Place. Theodore Winters must have been the second large outside stockman to move his expanding operation onto the plains. Otherwise, it would stand to reason that he could have moved on to the east side rather than the west. Had there been the case, the beautiful grassy meadow with all its springs on the extreme southeast corner of the Madeline Plains would have been known as the Winters Madeline Ranch, rather than the McKissick Madeline Ranch. That is not the way it turned out, however, and Winters established a place on the extreme northwest corner of the Madeline Plains at Marsh Creek. This place was known for over 10 years as Winters Marsh Place. Theodore Winters, although a wealthy racehorse man and a breeder of high-quality thoroughbred horseflesh, was a man who was definitely a match for the Madeline Plains. The amount of time he personally spent on the Marsh Place is questionable, as the actual living there was left up to hired men. But he was rough and unrefined, a tall, heavily built man with a coal-black hair and an enormous handlebar mustache. He was an impressive figure wherever he went, and his wealth was not inherited. He had earned every penny of it. He came west to California's gold fields from Illinois in 1849. There, he and his father and brothers ran a freighting business to the bustling mining camps in the Sierra foothills. When the gold began playing out, Theodore started freighting over the mountains to Carson City, Nevada. He acquired ranch properties in Washoe Valley, and when he got in early on the Comstock silver mining, he soon amassed a sizable fortune and discontinued his freighting. Winters was a man of many interests, and horse racing soon got into his blood. He began raising fine thoroughbreds and racing them all over the United States. All this time he was expanding his ranches also. He ran close to 1,000 head of cattle on his Washoe Valley properties alone. Then in the early 60s, he obtained the Smoke Creek Ranch below the Madeline Plains as he continued to expand northward. Post Camp, above the Shin Ranch, is so called because Theodore Winters' fencing crew cut posts there when the fencing of Smoke Creek was in progress. Winter's men moved his cattle on up from Smoke Creek through Post Camp to the Madeline Plains in the spring of early summer of 1868. But when they came over the hill into the southeast corner of the plains, J.D. Byers and Jake McKissick, buckaroos, were already camped there with their cattle. So Winter's men went on north another 25 miles with his cattle to Marsh Creek. In charge of the Madeline Plains operation that year was a young fellow, 21 years old, recently from Scott County, Arkansas, by the name of James G. Looper. Over the years, Looper continued to see after Winter's marsh place. Winters eventually assigned him the job, as was customary among large ranchers and their hired hands in those years, of homesteading the land around the springs. This gave the large operator control of the water and thus control of the surrounding range. Then, when the land was proven up on, the employer would buy it from the hired man at the set price of $500 for each 160 acres homesteaded. Then the hired man would go and file on another spring. Jim Looper, a rough and rowdy character, known for his orneriness, built himself a cabin to live in, which was required in order to prove up on a homestead. With the help of others, Winter's buckaroos, a nice setup was established on Marsh Creek. Corrals were built as well as a small barn, and the place was fenced. There were 320 acres total in the place, as Looper had filed on the 260-acre homesteads. So all of the good hay land in that corner of the plains was under fence. Looper and others of the hired help put up hay in the summers, and then Looper would stay there in the winter to feed whatever stock was not taken back to Smoke Creek. So Jim Looper lived there year-around for the next good many years, but due to a falling out with his boss, it was not Theodore Winters who ended up with the marsh place as originally planned. Next, we'll hear about Matt Haley, an Irishman at Tule Lake.